So I'm Noah, as Enzo said, and I was talking with Scott, one of the wonderful club overlords, a couple weeks ago, and he kept going on about Kerberoasting, which is a really interesting attack. And most of my experience comes with Unix-based systems, and this functions usually with like Windows Server. So it was a really good opportunity for me to do some research and learn a bit about Kerberoasting and Windows Server environment. And so yeah, I've only had a few days researching this, so if you have anything that you would like to add, I'd love to learn. So yeah, here's what I've learned so far. So first, this attack, and we'll go over this a little bit later, but this attack was first found in 2014, or at least first publicized in 2014. And at that time, 95% of all Fortune 500 companies were using Active Directory, which is a big deal. And this is from Microsoft, so there might be some bias here. But apparently 95% of Fortune 500 companies were using Active Directory. So what is Active Directory? Active Directory is a set of processes and services that assign roles to individual devices on the network. And it allows for centralized authorization, authentication, device management, and it generally allows you to partition resources on a network to authorize users and groups. There are a lot of services that can go along with it. Some domain services include group policy, BitLocker, DNS, remote desktop. But the focus of this talk is going to be specifically on Microsoft Kerberos. And the exact definition from their documentation says, the Kerberos protocol defines how clients interact with a network authentication service. Clients obtain tickets from the Kerberos Key Distribution Center, and they present these tickets to servers when connections are established. Kerberos tickets represent the client's network credentials. So long story short, Kerberos is an authentication mechanism. It's a protocol that can be used with Active Directory. And it essentially gives sort of, well, we'll get into that actually. I won't get ahead of it. We'll talk about it right here. So Kerberos provides authentication for Active Directory. And then Kerberoasting, which is the topic of discussion here, is the actual exploitation technique. So it was first publicized in 2014 by Tin Medin at DerbyCon. And it's a very dangerous attack because it has a perfect storm of a lot of issues because it allows for privilege escalation and lateral network movement. It takes advantage of weak user passwords, which are still very prevalent. It's very hard to detect, and it does not require domain admin credentials. So this attack can occur if you have any sort of access to the network, any domain user account. So let's sort of go over what an attack would look like. Step one, as I said, you need to have access to any domain user account. You can get this however you need, whether social engineering, maybe some sort of spear phishing attack. However it is, you sort of have to get a first foothold so you have access to a domain user's account. Step two, this step isn't as important in terms of the actual attack itself, but you have to authenticate with the domain and receive a ticket granting ticket from the Kerberos Key Distribution Center. But what really starts to get interesting is when we get to step three, which is where we use the ticket granting ticket to request a service ticket. So a service ticket, and we'll get more in depth in a sec, but a service ticket is essentially like, almost like a government issued ID where you can show it, say for example, at a bar before you go in. It is a credential that says, hey, I have access because I'm of age, or in this case, I'm the correct user to access this resource. And it's something that can't be modified by the user itself because it's encrypted with a key that's shared between the service that you want to access and the domain controller, which means the domain controller basically vouches for you, and you present this to the service and say, hey, the domain controller says, yep, I am authorized. So this sort of goes over kind of what I just said. So domain users are able to request service tickets for any entity with a service principal name set. Instead of requesting a ticket for a well-known service, an attacker could request a ticket for any user with an SPN set. And this is where the attack comes into play because you can have normal user accounts that have, or domain admin account that has an SPN set on it. The return ticket will be encrypted with a secret shared between the service and the domain controller. Now, generally speaking, if this is an actual service, the standard is to have randomized passwords that automatically change. That, for all intents and purposes, is uncrackable. Just because of the amount of time and resources it would take to crack it, it's pretty much uncrackable. However, if you have a user account that has the SPN set, the return ticket is going to be encrypted with the hash of their user account password. User account passwords generally aren't 128 characters long, and they're usually pretty easy to guess, and we'll get more into that next, actually. So this is sort of an overview of the steps I just mentioned. We're not going to go through and read all of this, but essentially you have step one, and you can get the slide later and take a look at this if you're interested, but step one, you authenticate. Step two, you get the ticket granting ticket. And then step 3 and 4, this is where you request a service ticket and get back the ticket that's encrypted with the password hash of the user. So to sort of summarize what this means, it means an attacker with access to any domain user account can essentially request tickets for any other user account with an SPN set. The tickets are encrypted with that user's account password hash, meaning that it can be brute forced offline as you would any other password with no rate limiting or chance of detection. And that's where this gets really dangerous, because it essentially eliminates the step in an attack where you have to first compromise a service before you can get password hashes. It essentially gives you password hashes, because if you think about it, you can create maybe a dictionary attack using Crunch and generate a whole bunch of NTLM hashes for passwords that you think might be the user's account password, and then try to decrypt the ticket using that list of hashes you've generated, and whichever hash works, well, their account password is a password that was hashed into the hash. Next. So final step. As I said, you just extract the service ticket from memory and crack it offline. And this, again, has no rate limiting because it's not a network-based attack in the sense that once you acquire the service ticket, you can just brute force with unlimited speed depending on how many resources you have. And there's no chance of detection because it all happens on your local machine. So this gets a little bit more technical for people who are interested. This is not necessary to know for how the attack works, but I thought it was kind of cool. So service tickets are encrypted by default with RC4, which is very old and very simplistic. It just exclusive-ors pseudorandom bits with the data you're looking to encrypt. And it's a stream cipher, unlike AES block cipher in this case. And AES was not supported by default. And through Windows Server 2016, it was impossible, basically, to enforce AES by default against an attacker. Because the attacker could just say, oh, well, even though the domain admin said use AES, I don't support AES, so when I'm requesting the certificate, the highest encryption I support is RC4, and you could send that in the request, and they would still, there's no way to override RC4. And finally, in Windows 2019, all versions of this were patched. But the point is RC4 just adds insult to injury because it's very, very efficient compared to AES, which means you can brute force a heck of a lot faster. And it's still possible to brute force an AES encrypted ticket, it's just a lot slower. So an interesting point. And you can see at the end, if you want to look WEP versus WPA, WEP used RC4, WPA uses AES. Think about how easy it is to crack one versus the other. And there's a lot more details on there, but you get the idea. So, final summary. If you can compromise any domain user on a network that uses Active Directory, and as that user requests a service ticket for any other user that has an SPN set, you can then brute force that ticket and you will have that user's account credentials. This attack, as we said, is about 6 years old, but it's still applicable to this day and gives the attacker the potential to gain credentials to any other account, even admin accounts. And the problem is that people change their passwords in Windows Active Directory, but service accounts often get forgotten, and they usually have old, weak passwords that are sort of shoved under the rug. And as I mentioned before, even a domain admin can have an SPN set, which means you could theoretically, in 30 seconds, have full domain admin access from a super low-level account. The biggest thing about this attack is that Kerberoasting cannot be stopped, and that is why it's still prevalent to this day. And the reason is because it deals with how Kerberos protocol itself works. The entire authentication mechanism where you have, where you can request service tickets is in and of itself the vulnerability. That being said, there are ways to mitigate this attack, so let's go over some of those. So first, this is across the board, always use the latest version of whatever operating system you're using, Windows Server in this case. Enforce AES, it'll help it'll help slow down the brute force attack against passwords. And then the most important one, set strict password standards that are enforced across all users. At the end of the day, this is a simple password brute force attack. So if you can ensure that people have strong passwords that are long enough and aren't going to be in a standard password list, then you can not have to worry as much about this attack. So there are more technical solutions to this. For example, you can have like an intrusion detection system that can look for a whole bunch of service ticket requests that aren't normal activity on the network. This isn't perfect. An attacker might not spam for every single service ticket, so it's hit or miss, but it's better than nothing. And a more modern approach, but one that's still not widely used as far as I can tell, is to set up honey accounts. And these are accounts that have an SPN set, and it might be, you know, like super secret server with credit card details on it. And an attacker will be like, ooh, let me hack this, and the password will be password. And it's an account that's super enticing, easy to compromise, yet is not actually used for anything on the network. And as soon as somebody logs in, the admin will get an alert, and they'll be like, okay, well, that's an attacker, because it's not used for anything real on our network. So yeah, there are ways to mitigate the attack, but there is no known way to, or it's impossible to outright stop the attack. Resources. So when I was researching this, there are a lot of good resources online. There's a talk, actually, that you can look up on YouTube by the original guy who first publicized this attack. And yeah, so if you're interested in learning more, feel free to check out any of these resources. And there's also, in the future, I might do another talk on ASREP roasting, which deals with a misconfiguration in Kerberos, and it's just another type of attack. So yeah, thank you very much.
Nice job, man.